Coming up on today's episode, Paul Barthorpe discusses his time as Farsley owner.
The agreement was done, we'd signed it, Bradford Park Avenue had signed it.
Neil Redfearn's stint in charge.
We weren't able to get players over the line.
The recent demise in the club.
I've had no involvement with the club since the beginning of February, so I don't know. I've got documented proof of what the debt was when I left. The facts speak for themselves. You have to be realistic about it. Is it realistic that they haven't heard about a debt that's 2 years old? No, of course it isn't. The strategy is to use me as a scapegoat and throw me in the bus. Then that's the way they feel they need to go to be able to get control over the club.
And he updates us on the sale of Farsley Celtic.
I can categorically state there's not been one single offer to buy the club since I bought it in 2018, not one.
Away from the Citadel podcast, hosted by Charlie Fawcett and Luke Helliwell.
Welcome to Away from the Citadel. I'm Charlie Fawcett, and I'm of course joined by Luke Helliwell. How are you doing, Luke?
I'm not too bad. Charlie, how are you doing?
I'm good. And we're also joined by a very special guest today in Paul Barthorpe. How are you doing, Paul?
Hi guys, I'm very well, thank yourselves.
Very good, mate, yeah?
Good to hear it.
Why did you want to buy the football club at first? What was your initial reasoning for investing in Farsley? So,
in 2018, Farsley were in a difficult financial position. I had another business that worked in and around the footballing arena, and I was made aware by a former employee that if someone didn't go in and say and put some money into the club, it'd be done. Having worked in football for a long time, you kind of see the good, the bad, and you see how well clubs run, how badly clubs are run. And I thought, given the situation the club was in, that I could go there and do a job. So approached the then owner who was looking to sell, and that's kind of how it came about. Really, it was never a long-term plan or ambition. It was a conversation that was basically somebody needs to go in and do something here. Are you interested?
What was the thought around renaming the ground and rebranding the club badge? What was your thought process when you started?
So we actually engaged with a marketing company when I first came in, and they identified a number of issues with the branding as it was. The club had obviously gone bust once in 2010 and was close again. And they came back to us and said, look, the association of Celtic is green and white, not blue. The Rangers blue didn't make much sense. And they said, looking at the club badge, with the research they'd done, not a lot of people understood why there was a ram on the club badge. And we felt that the fire around the outside, which represented the club's rebirth after it had gone bust the previous time, wasn't something that you particularly want to be remembered on a club badge. So we came up with the idea of renaming the club the Citadel because obviously the Celts, the Celt Army, the Celt Army would have been at a citadel, and every home ground you want to make your fortress. So it kind of worked. So the whole rebranding really was because unfortunately it hadn't worked once before and it was going down the same route again. So we thought if we try something completely different, then maybe we stand a better chance of making more of a success of it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously speaking to a marketing team makes sense, but obviously with football being so traditionalist, do you not think it would have made sense to maybe speak to the fans about this sort of thing as well? Because as a football fan myself, I'm very passionate about the identity. Do you not think that made sense?
To be honest with you, at the time, I was putting money into the club before I actually owned it. And at the time, the legals took longer than we expected, so I didn't actually come in until the end of June, which with the pre-season starting in July, everything was a bit of a rush. So benefit of hindsight, it probably could have been something that was handled better. But at the time, we thought we need to get something done quickly because we need to get the club out of the situation it's in.
Obviously, this season has been a bit of a car crash for Farsley, but I was just wondering, what do you think are the main catalysts for the recent collapse in Farsley Celtic?
So obviously, we started the season with the intention of redoing the pitch. We had a number of issues with the contractors, which was just down the legal route. It's still on the legal route now. There's a lot of money still hung up in that. And obviously playing away from home doesn't help. I was putting in a lot of money to keep the club going because that's what you do. And unfortunately, around October, November time, there's quite an aggressive social media campaign, which was obviously aimed at myself. But the reality is, if you're aiming at the owner of a business, it's going to have an effect on that business, and it did. So there isn't particularly one thing that is the main reason for the issues we've had this season. It's been a number of them. If the contractor hadn't done what they've done, which I think is well documented by now, we wouldn't have been in that situation. I certainly wouldn't have invested the money I have in the planning and in everything else if it wasn't going to go ahead. Certainly,
sorry, Paul.
Go on. You certainly don't put yourself in a position where you have no pitch. That's no one on this planet would do that. And obviously we're struggling financially. We're trying to get out of the hole we're in, and pumping money in left, right, and centre to keep things going, which is the nature of the beast, really. And unfortunately, a lot of fans started to turn, a lot of contractors, a lot of suppliers started to turn on the social media campaign, and obviously then at that point became untenable for me to be there. But a lot of things that put out there weren't true and were actually quite damaging. So a couple of the more damaging ones I saw were that I wasn't the one funding the club, and also by the same person, that there were offers for the club for people to buy it. So, if you're looking at it from a third party point of view and you see issues at the club, you think, well, somebody else is willing to buy it and he's not putting the money in anyway, so let's get him out. Whereas the reality was, I was the one funding it, which I think since I left, they lost every single game, 16 games in a row, got relegated, lost a lot of the first team. And obviously, the bills are mounting because they're not being paid. And with the best will in the world, I know the board came in with great intentions, and I think they had hopes of funding partners coming on board that perhaps didn't materialise. So the situation at the moment isn't ideal, but it's not the end of Farsley Celtic.
Hopefully so. You touch upon the social media campaign. How was, obviously, you spoke in the club statement a few months ago about the threats you were getting. How did that affect the way you were running the club? Did that obviously feel a bit demoralising when you were trying your best to save the club?
To be honest, it was more disappointing because, the reality is that I put more money into this club than anybody else in the history of the club. That's a fact. You can, these are all easily provable. We got the club through COVID. When I took the club, it was in financial difficulty. The buildings were all condemned. Spent a lot of money and time bringing the club up to a certain standard. It cost me 50 odd grand to get us up to ground grading, because when I took it, we got promoted. And obviously keeping Farsley in the National League North is a challenge in itself. We're a small village team with one of the smallest gates in the league and the smallest fund. It's difficult, and people always like the David and Goliath story. David beat Goliath once. We beat it every year in a row, and it's difficult, And a lot of the things that were said on social media, in particular the death threats, it didn't change the way I ran the business. It was just disappointing, because when you put 6 years of your life into something and significant amounts of money, and you've achieved a lot. We by the end of it, we've got the deaf team who are all conquering. We've got education system there, elite talent squad, 40 odd teams in development section, none of which was there when I got there. So it's a little bit frustrating, upsetting that's forgotten. But I suppose that's football, isn't it? That's just the way it goes.
Yeah, and I mean, culminating in you obviously being hospitalised, it must have been an awful time for you to be the owner of Farsley. But touching on the current custodians of the club, do you think it's a little bit unfair that a lot of the blame seems to be shifted onto you when, there was other people behind the scenes that contributed to the decisions made?
Well, the reality is you're a board of directors. I've heard a lot of things since, like there's a lot of debts they didn't know about, things like that. In all seriousness, I've not been there for 4 months, and I find it difficult to hear things like that, because you don't have creditors that don't email the club or send letters to the club for months and months and years on end. It doesn't happen. So it's easy to use me as a scapegoat, and it's easy, if you're a member board or you're somebody who's at the club, it's easy to use me as a scapegoat because you're still there. And you don't want to be associated with what happened last season. And if that's the way they choose to go about it, then that's fine. I've known some of those board members a number of years, and the board that are there now I appointed. So I know the qualities they've got, and if that's the way it's going, then again, that's a shame. But the facts speak for themselves. You have to be realistic in these situations. Is it easy to blame me? Yeah, of course it is. As a board of directors, are you all responsible? Yes, you are. It's easy to say we didn't know this, we didn't know that, we didn't know the other, but it's not overly realistic. So again, it's always disappointing, but it's human nature, isn't it? If you're still in the thick of it, the last thing you want is to be associated with any negativity. So, as in everything, every walk of life, if somebody's walked away or the person at the top's walked away, it's easier to pile everything on them because they've gone.
Absolutely. So, touching on the start of this season, I was just wondering, what was your main influence into the decision to take up the pitch? What was your aim at the end of that?
So, as I alluded to earlier, we're a village team punching well above our weight in a much bigger league than we are. Financially, the club was losing 6 figures a year that I was, making up. So it came to the point where you have to do something to change that. We've got all these development squads, these great young kids that are playing for the club. We've got the education system, and the club's paying out over £100,000 a year in other facilities. So if we're losing a significant amount of money paying for the facilities, and there's the opportunity to stop the rot, if you like, in terms of the club losing money because it's a small club at a high level, then it was a no-brainer to put the pitch in. I paid for planning, I put the deposits down, as we did, and the pitch was taken up as part of the development program. So that was always the plan, was to try and turn the club into a self-sustaining entity as opposed to losing the significant amount of money it does on an annual basis. And a lot of clubs at our level, and all levels, lose money, but to sustain Fars in the National League North, we needed a long-term solution, long-term strategy, because as with a lot of clubs, you get one person at the top that's putting the money in. If they go, then what? You need to find somebody quick to put the money in, and we didn't want to be in that situation. We wanted to be able to, first of all, make the club self-sustaining, but also a lot of our juniors and development teams weren't training or playing at the club, so they had no understanding of what Farsley Celtic actually was. They wore the badge, but had no physical grounding or physical association with the club. So it worked for us on a number of different levels to bring a synthetic pitch in.
So, in hindsight, then, do you think it was a wise decision?
Well, hindsight, there's absolutely no way we could have known the issues we found. There's absolutely no way we could have foreseen an issue with the contractor, the legals. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but you can't. You have a plan A and a plan B, but you can't legislate for certain things. And the things that happened, we never in our wildest dreams imagined that would happen. Yeah,
so just before I pass over to Luke, I was just wondering whether there's any truth in the rumours that you've had offers for the club and rejected them. Is there any truth in that?
I can categorically state there's not been one single offer to buy the club since I bought it in 2018, not one.
Right.
And that's a fact. The things I'm telling you are quite easily proven. If somebody claims to put an offer in, then show me the offer. Show a legal offer. But there's been nothing. And again, that's one of the things that was pretty damaging, those claims that offers have come in, because people think, well, if offers have come in, just accept them and go. Well, I can't accept an offer that's never come in. You see a lot of things on social media. Oh, I'll buy it. Okay, that's great. But I need something formal, not just I'll buy it on social media.
Thank you, Charlie. So my first question, Paul, is obviously games were played majority in Buxton. What were the reasoning why you played in Buxton and not somewhere which is closer?
Okay, so we had an agreement with Bradford Park Avenue to go there and play our home games there. The agreement was done. We'd signed it. Bradford Park Avenue had signed it. It was just sent to the league for ratification. And then on the Friday, the league added another clause, which hadn't been in the original agreement, which stated that Bradford Park Avenue had to give priority to us over fixtures because we were a higher placed team. And obviously at that point, Bradford Park Avenue said, we can't do that. Understandably so, we can't do that. So the league then gave us until the Monday, which was 72 hours, to find an alternative venue. So we spent the whole weekend looking for every possible local venue. But the problem was a lot of them didn't meet ground grading for the National League North. We even tried Odsal Stadium. We tried anything and everything. So the reality was nobody met ground grading for our level. And the only ones that did had grass pitches, so they weren't willing to let their pitch be damaged by another team playing on it. So, believe it or not, geographically speaking, the nearest club with a synthetic pitch at our level that would let us play in it is Buxton.
On to my next question. Neil Redfearn was appointed during the season, but he departed after 3 weeks. What were the reasoning why Neil departed the football club?
Well, we were looking to bring in a lot of players, and we couldn't get the players in quick enough. There are a few issues around training and everything else, and we had a lot of injuries. And I think Neil just got to the point where he came in to do a job, and we weren't able to get players over the line that he wanted quick enough. There's a lot of things we weren't able to do quick enough to make the changes to give Neil a fighting chance. It's frustrating because he came in and he was great. Really good guy, really positive, and he changed the formation. And a couple of games he was here, he made a difference. But football's football, and you have to understand when somebody of Neil's caliber comes in, and things that he wants to happen aren't happening. I totally understand his frustration. So I don't know what he's doing now, but I'm sure whatever he's doing is be successful at it.
Do you think Farsley Celtic will survive this period, or do you think it's an uphill task?
I think it'll survive. I've got documented proof of what the debt was when I left. With the best will in the world, I know these directors have worked very hard, but unfortunately, I can't imagine a lot's been paid over the last 4 months, and that's not a slight on them. It's just the reality of the situation. But I know a lot of the suppliers that I worked with in my time there would not want the club to go bust. So whatever debt there currently is in the club, I'm sure those creditors would work with the club to work out of it, because at the end of the day, nobody wants the club to vanish. And, the biggest creditor at the club is me. The club owes me more than everyone else put together. But again, I'm not going to push that. That's, why would it? Would make no sense. So I'd be very surprised if the club folded, because it's not in a position where it would need to, in my opinion. But it wasn't a couple of months ago. I don't think it would be now.
Are there any decisions that you've made that you regret since taking over the football club?
Well, the thing about taking over a football club is that there's no job description. There's no one to talk to. There's nobody to ask, because every club is different with its own unique set of problems. And it's very difficult because you're learning as you go. I was on 38 when I took the club, and looking at the benefit of hindsight, we worked hard not to get relegated every season, but had one of those. It's not a decision, obviously, but had one of those seasons we've been relegated and then fought our way back up, would that have made things different? It's difficult to look back and say the decisions we regret making, because at the time you're making them for the best reasons, and you're making them because you're doing it for the best for your club. You don't spend 6 years at a club and put a hell of a lot of time, effort, and money into it to do anything bad to it. It's every day. You don't get a day off. You deal with everything from ticketing prices to retail stocks to bringing players into. There isn't one part of the club you don't touch. So it's all consuming. It literally takes every minute of your time. So to have done that for 6 years and put in massive amounts of money, there's probably a lot of decisions that, with the benefit of hindsight, would have been better, but we had no benchmark to follow. We were so there's no one you can ask for advice because there wasn't anybody else. Nobody else had run Farsley Celtic in the National League North. Nobody else was in the position we were in. So you kind of make decisions because they need to be made there, and then you can't wait. And every decision we made, to a point, was relatively successful. We were in the National League North for 5 years in a row. So we must have been doing a lot of things right. It was said before, successful, a lot of great volunteers at the club that made it happen. And you've got the successful academy, successful development section, successful deaf, successful ladies section, and that's because of all the great people at the club and the decisions that we made to make this happen. So probably a lot of decisions, a lot of things that you look back and go, perhaps if I hadn't done that, perhaps if we hadn't signed that player, perhaps if we hadn't put them on that money, perhaps if we hadn't. But it's everything you do in football is a risk, because unlike a lot of businesses where you're selling a set product, football isn't a set product. It changes every week, every day. Your players are on form, your players are off form, your manager has a bad day. There's so many variables that change every single day. So it's difficult to make decisions because everything is new. Even after 5 or 6 years, you're facing new challenges and new situations and scenarios that you've not faced before. So I'm sure, I'll be told of 1,000 things I did wrong and 1,000 decisions I made wrong. But you have to remember that the decisions were made based on the information we've got, and we as a board and myself as the owner had unique access to information that nobody else did. So you might question a lot of decisions and say, why has that happened? But we did it based on the information we had at hand. And that's the only way you can kind of make decisions at a club like ours.
Now you come on here and told your side of the story, have you got a message for the Farsley Celtic supporters?
There's a lot of supporters out there that are negative towards me. You're totally right in your opinion. A lot of ones out there that are positive as well. But what you have to understand is that owning and running Farsley Celtic in the National League North is an incredibly difficult job. One of the smallest clubs in the league. We are, fighting every year just to survive. The financial losses aren't great. But there isn't one person at that club, myself included, that hasn't put in a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of graft, and done everything with the best intentions of the club. As I said, the amount of money I put in is more than anyone else in the history of the club. Where we were in 2018 to where we are now is hugely different in terms of size of the club, in terms of facilities, in terms of everything we've done. Yes, last season was horrendous in so many different ways, and I can only apologise for that. It was never anyone's intention. If we'd have had any inkling into the problems we'd have had with the contract as anybody else, we wouldn't have done it. But obviously we didn't. We didn't know that. Otherwise we wouldn't have put the money in and done what we've done. But what I would say is that don't lose hope. I know things aren't looking great at the moment, but the future's a very long time. And, although as it stands at the moment, there isn't an offer for the club still. I am speaking to a number of people that I believe can take the club forward. And I'm doing all I can to make sure that Farsley as a club continues. And I'm doing all I can to make sure that Farsley could be successful into the future.
What was the main reasoning behind, obviously, there was parts of this season when the players stopped being paid. Why was that?
When in the season?
I'm purely going off of just, things I've heard. I'm not necessarily pointing fingers at anyone. I'm just saying.
Well, obviously, at the beginning of the season, they were a week late on payment, plain and simply because we put the planning in, we submitted the planning for the pitch, and the council came back with a number of the surveys that needed doing, and we were up against it in terms of time, so we had to allocate the funds to that. I couldn't get the money out quick enough to cover the wages. When I got it out, I cleared it. As to what's happened since I left, I can't tell you because I don't know. I don't know where we are in terms of player payments. I can only assume that a lot of them left or where they are because for whatever reason maybe. So I can't answer that one. But obviously, you'll find that there's a lot of football clubs at our level, above and below, players are paid late, unfortunately. It's just the nature of the way it is at the moment in football. It's not ideal. It's not an excuse. It's not acceptable. But unfortunately, when you're working hand to mouth and you're playing money in every week, sometimes, the odd week that does happen. And again, as unacceptable as that is, I'm just trying to be honest with you about the facts of where it's at.
Just wondering, are you still committed to selling the club if a decent buyer comes in that you think can take the club forward? Would you definitely sell?
Absolutely. You don't own a club for 6 years and not love it. You don't put the time, effort, and money in that I put in and not love it and not want to see it successful and thriving. The last thing I would ever want is that club to go under, because the love for the club and the years and the time and effort you put in, I just can't imagine that happening. As I said, there have been absolutely no formal offers whatsoever, ever, for the club, and that is a fact. And as it stands now, there still aren't. But I am speaking to one or two people who I hope will step up and who I hope will lead the club into the future. From my point of view, it can't fold. It can't happen.
Good stuff. One more question for you before we go. What are your thoughts on the current board? Obviously, there's been a bit of discontent among the fan base, but for you personally, what are your opinions on them?
I know them all, and I point them all to the board for a reason. I don't have any personal issues with any of them at all. I've heard some things, like I said earlier, that are coming out of the board, and you know what? It's not true, but if that's the way they want to go about things, that's fine. They're in a very, very difficult position. They were given the reins of a club, and when they took over, they gave me assurances they got money coming in, and assurances about the pitch, which obviously haven't happened. But knowing the guys that are on the board, the reasons it hasn't happened would have been because whatever assurances they'd had, they've been let down. I don't know what's happened since I left on the board. I'm not privy to any of that sort of information. But they came into the club at a difficult time, and they've done what they can. The club's limped through to the end of the season. Okay, there's things that, as I said earlier, I've heard that I'm not happy about, but the facts speak for themselves. You have to be realistic about it. Is it realistic that they haven't heard about a debt that's 2 years old? No, of course it isn't. I'm not local, so I don't pick the mail up at the club. I don't control and never have controlled the accountant's email address, or I've never have controlled Xero, which is the accounting system at the club. I've never had access to that. It was never my job. So, to say they haven't heard of debts is a bit naughty, really. But so they've stepped in at a difficult time, and they've done the best they can. That's all you can ask from anybody. I don't know anything more than that. I'm not local, so I don't hear what's said. The only things that I'm told are what people have said that they've been upset about and they don't agree with. But everyone's entitled to their own opinion. And if the strategy is to use me as a scapegoat and throw me under the bus, then that's the way they feel they need to go to be able to get control of the club. And as the owner of a football club, and as I said, it's disappointing given what I've put in and the time I've put in, but I don't have any issue with anybody on the board whatsoever. I don't think anybody can argue that they have come in any time. I don't think anybody can argue that they've kept it going to the end of the season. Should a new buyer come in, I don't know whether they'd retain the board or not. That's their decision. But I'm not going to sit here and say anything negative about those guys because I put them on the board for a reason. And I still believe that the reasons they were put on the board, I still believe that they've got those capabilities. And if they were made promises of finance that hasn't come in, that's not really their fault.
Were you forced out of the club, or did you leave on your own accord?
I wasn't forced out, no. The reality was it became untenable because everything that was directed at me day after day after day after day was damaging the business. You can't attack the owner of a business and not expect it to have an effect on the business. It's logical. It makes logical sense. People aren't going to have any trust in a business where the owner's getting ripped to pieces on a daily basis. So, it was a conversation that we had with the board that my position, as long as I was the club, that abuse would not stop. So it made business sense. It made every sense in the world to step away in the hope that all the negativity would stop, which it did. So, it's for the benefit of everybody, really.
Absolutely. Well, that's all we've got time for today. But thanks a lot for joining us, Paul. That was a really interesting interview, and I'm sure it'll go a long way to just getting more communication with the supporters, really. But thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.
I'm happy to be here, guys. Thanks for the time.
Away from the Citadel podcast, hosted by Charlie Fawcett and Luke Helliwell.